should learn a lesson from this situation to unite, to make integration a reality.
Draped in the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso, and flanked by soldiers who helped bring him to power, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the cameras and made a declaration that stunned not just his nation, but the entire African continent. It was not about Burkina Faso alone. It wasn't about insurgencies, foreign aid, or even trade deals. It was something far bigger. Traoré called for a single African government, one united political entity, one shared currency, Afro-money, and one African passport that would erase all borders and allow 1.4 billion Africans to move freely within their own continent. The silence that followed his speech was brief. It quickly erupted into thunderous cheers from the crowd, and online it spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #United States of Africa and #Afromoney surged from Lagos to Nairobi to Johannesburg. Pan-African voices praised it as a new chapter in Africa's long journey toward unity, while global analysts scrambled to interpret whether Traoré's vision was revolutionary leadership or a dangerous gamble. But what makes this moment different from countless other speeches about African unity? Traoré isn't just talking, he's acting. This is the same leader who expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, rejected loans from the IMF and World Bank, and strengthened ties with fellow military governments in Mali and Niger through the Alliance of Sahel states. He's building something new, not just imagining it. Unlike those before him who spoke of unity in vague, hopeful tones, Traoré delivered his vision with a sense of urgency. Insiders in his administration claim that task forces are already studying how to implement this continental blueprint. They're exploring what a shared currency would look like, how a Central African authority might function, and how passports could be unified under a single African identity. This announcement caught many African leaders off guard. There were no quiet consultations, no gradual proposals, just a direct and bold unveiling. And not every government welcomed it. For some, especially those whose economies are tightly bound to foreign capital, Traoré's ideas are seen as risky, even threatening. That in Western capitals, the alarm bells are ringing. A united Africa, economically, militarily, diplomatically, would be a global force. It would speak with one voice. And that, to many foreign powers used to dealing with a fragmented continent, is deeply unsettling. But for everyday Africans, especially the youth, Traoré's words touched something deeper than policy. Spoke to identity. It spoke to freedom. Generations have grown up hemmed in by colonial-era borders. Africans often face more visa restrictions traveling to neighboring African countries than they do visiting Europe or the Middle East. Regional trade is choked by bureaucracy, and currency instability punishes cooperation. The dream of Pan-African unity has long felt like a distant ideal. Now one leader is saying, it doesn't have to be. But unity is not just an idea, it's a challenge. Who would lead this unified Africa? What political system would replace the current patchwork of democracies, monarchies, and military regimes? Would sovereignty be sacrificed? Would rivalries resurface? These questions are real. And yet, they don't erase the fact that something has shifted. To understand Traoré's vision, we have to go back in history. Back to the colonial mapmakers of the 19th century, who drew artificial borders with little regard for Africa's diverse communities. After independence, those lines became hardened into national identities, often fiercely defended, rarely questioned. Governments worked in isolation. Cooperation became rare. What Traoré is offering is a rejection of that colonial inheritance, a return to unity, a belief that Africa's future must be built collectively, not as 54 separate nations competing for scraps, but as one civilization asserting its rightful place in the world. This idea is not new. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, in the 1960s, passionately argued for immediate African union. He feared that political independence without economic and military unity would leave Africa exposed to foreign domination. He was right. In the decades since, Africa has been courted and manipulated by external powers seeking access to its resources, its votes in global institutions, and its markets. The result? Dependency, division, underdevelopment. But Traoré, unlike many who came before him, is not starting from scratch. He's laying this proposal on top of real regional efforts like the AES and policies rejecting foreign military dependency. This isn't a dream, it's a project. And central to that project is Afromoney, the proposed single currency that would replace the patchwork of national currencies currently in use. Today, many African countries still operate under colonial-era monetary systems. The CFA franc, for example, remains tied to the euro and ultimately controlled by the French treasury. Even outside the CFA zone, most African economies depend heavily on the US dollar and euro for trade. Traoré's Afro-money seeks to end that dependency. It's not just about easier trade, it's about sovereignty. It's about finally giving African economies the tools to grow on their own terms. Right now, only around 17% of African trade happens within the continent. Most countries trade more with Europe or Asia than with their neighbors. Afro-money could change that by eliminating currency conversion costs, stabilizing exchange rates, and encouraging African businesses to look inward, rather than overseas. But beyond the economics, Afro-money would be a symbol, a statement that Africa is ready to speak the language of power. A single currency suggests confidence, strength, and unity. It tells the world, Africa is done being a pawn in someone else's game. Of course, creating Afro-money isn't simple. It requires economic convergence, shared inflation targets, interest rates, and banking rules. Europe's own struggles with the euro highlight the difficulty, and African economies are far more diverse. How would a single currency be managed? Who would issue it? Would countries willingly give up control over their central banks? These are big questions. But for many Africans, especially the youth, they're questions worth answering because the benefits could be life-changing. Then comes the third pillar, One African Passport. While Afro-money speaks to economic power, the One African Passport speaks to dignity and identity. Every year, millions of Africans face harsh visa requirements just to visit countries next door. Meanwhile, they often find it easier to enter former colonial powers than to cross African borders. Traoré wants to change that completely. His proposed passport would give every African citizen the freedom to live, work, and travel anywhere on the continent. It would dissolve borders created not for African benefit, but for colonial conquest. This isn't just symbolic. It could transform Africa's economies by opening up labor markets, allowing goods and services to move more freely, and boosting tourism. It could allow African families divided by arbitrary borders to reunite. And perhaps most importantly, it would create a shared sense of belonging. The African Union has long included a common passport in its Agenda 2063 vision. Regional blocs like ECOWAS already allow freer movement. But Traoré's call is different. It's not gradual. It's immediate. It's total. Naturally, this raises concerns. Could insurgents exploit open borders? Would some countries bear the brunt of migration pressures? Are Africa's roads, airports, and railways ready for that kind of mobility? Security remains a key issue. Trust among nations will need to grow. A continent-wide ID system, unified immigration laws, and digital databases would need to be developed and protected. But for millions of Africans, especially youth and entrepreneurs, these challenges are worth facing. Because the alternative, remaining divided, restricted, and dependent, is no longer acceptable. And this brings us back to the bigger question. Can Africa unite? Traoré's announcement, while visionary, faces serious political resistance. National leaders aren't eager to give up power. Economic disparities between countries create distrust. And many African governments are still battling instability, insurgencies, or foreign interference. But for the first time in decades, the conversation has shifted. This isn't just talk. Traoré has opened a real path. One that begins with intention and grows with action. While some critics dismiss it as a fantasy, others see it as the long-awaited beginning of Africa's rise. Social media movements, student organizations, and youth-led startups are already embracing the idea. African heroes like Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba are being revived as symbols of this new unity. And ordinary people, traders, teachers, farmers are beginning to ask what a truly united Africa could mean for their lives. This isn't just about politics. It's about healing. It's about finally dismantling the chains of colonialism, borders, currencies, and passports, and building a future that is free, prosperous, and African by design. The question is no longer, is unity possible? It's, can Africa afford to stay divided? History tells us that radical change often begins with bold declarations. That one speech, one moment, can shift a continent's destiny. Whether Traoré's United States of Africa becomes a reality or not, one thing is certain: the conversation has begun. and it will not be silenced.